Why, it's just like I signed this just yesterday.
Welcome to Virtual Book Signing. I'm Daniel Weinberg, and as always, we're here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago, or almost always. We're sometimes on the road. Appreciate your taking some time today to watch our show. I think it's an interesting one, different one, a tasty one, actually, so that we're all going to have a taste of what the show is a little bit later on, by the way. We have a number of people who have come in from the warmth of Chicago to be with us today. If you're watching the archive, we'll probably have signed books still here for you, so please do call or email in if you'd like a signed first edition. Katherine Eighmey, award-winning author and cook, who interconnects food and history, I think, in quite a fascinating manner. She's an author of 7 books, including Soda Pop Salvation, Food Will Win the War, and A Prairie Kitchen. She blogs on food and history at What Lincoln Enjoyed Eating, and her website, raiskitchen.net. She's won blue ribbons in the Minnesota and Iowa State Fair food competitions. We'll have to talk about that. Her latest book is right here, Abraham Lincoln in the Kitchen, a culinary view of Lincoln's life and times. It's 288 pages, 24. And there are 53 recipe illustrations in here for you to try. So this is an interactive book. Now, in fact, on the carton when it came in, I quickly glanced at it. It said carton count of 24. I initially thought it said calorie count 24. I thought that's not bad for a $288 book. We're also going to be highlighting another book that goes along with this, Wayne Temple's book, My Taste is in My Mouth a Little. This is an older work. It's from 2004, but we do have first editions. It's 704 pages, and it's $39.95, and it's signed. Lincoln's Victuals and Potables, and I think you'll enjoy this. We'll talk a little bit about this as time goes on in our show. I found your book difficult to read because I'm a reader of notes. And I got to the back, and they're so good that I was continually enticed to go into another book that you brought me to. So the notes in the back are really fabulous. I know we talked about no footnotes in here, but the narrative notes, as you say, are really fabulous and will bring all of us to other books and that you might want to go to and where you got some of your ideas. What were some of your best sources to go to for all of this, both Lincoln and, of course, the nation?
Well, certainly Dr. Temple's book was of tremendous help. It's sort of an encyclopedic look at everything that Lincoln sort of encountered in the ways of food. So it was a good place to kind of check where I was going and to get some quick insights. But as far as understanding Lincoln and food in depth, what I found particularly instructive were Herndon's Informants, which is, also another kind of encyclopedic book. And what I had discovered...
It's Doug Wilson's book.
Yeah, Doug Wilson's book that is available in print since the 90s. Before that, the information was there, of course, on microfilm or in manuscript. So I was able to read that and see where other biographers had taken little food snippets, but had not looked at the context with a cook's eye. And so when I looked at what the quote was incomplete from, his Indiana neighbors, I could see, well, here's an insight here that tells me a little bit more. So that was a good source. And then I think one of the other one is that Lincoln Among His Friends there, where the young boy who talks about, now an adult, talks about how his mother had come home and seen Abraham Lincoln. She helped in the house, helping Mary out when they had parties, and recalled Lincoln coming home when he's a Springfield lawyer, putting on a blue apron and helping Mary in the kitchen. And that just opened my eyes to the possibility of seeing this as an avenue to bring some life into the Lincoln that we're used to seeing. You're reading about speeches, you're reading about political activities, but here was a human man. And if we can begin to taste some of what he tasted, we can sit with a biscuit, a sourdough, sour milk biscuit, and really chew on that dense piece of bread. we could begin to see what it might have been like to be a soldier in the Black Hawk War or a boy on the prairie.
Well, you are what you eat, I think, and so that's why we're going to learn a great deal about Lincoln today. Lincoln, among his friends, Rufus Rockwell Wilson, we both started in the same spot in the Lincoln world, because you saw the apron and got into the Lincoln world, and my second week at the shop back in 1971, September, I got ill, and I had to go home from work, and I just picked up a book to read and start to learn about Lincoln, and I picked up his other book, Intimate Memories of Lincoln, which came out as a sequel to this. They're difficult to find, by the way, and they're wonderful pieces. And that brought me into the world of Lincoln as well. But I've been asked many times in this shop, how do you know something, especially signatures, are authentic? And I say it's years and years of toiling in the area. So I presume the same is with you, that how do you know that the recipes you have and those of us out here can now make are authentic?
Well, I've spent about 20 years working with 19th century recipes, and I've taken them from primary sources, so I was able to go back either to a book that I bought, an antiquarian book, or a reprint. And so I know I'm looking at how homemakers cooked from in 1828 or 1865 or 1840. So, when you start with the original source, you kind of know what you're looking at. And so then when you see things that are brought forward into the modern years, you can kind of look at it and say, well, maybe that ingredient wasn't here then, back in the 1840s, so let's, see what we can find to be authentic.
Well, you're very careful in your book about that,
I try.
and to describe how you're going along and trying different methods and different ingredients to try to make something that you feel is what you found in the sources.
Yeah, my goal was to get as close to the original period tastes and textures and still be able to make it in a modern kitchen.
Well, let's talk a bit about that. What are the accommodations that one has to make? There are different cooking methods and ingredients. So how do you accommodate the modern kitchen?
Well, I start with a stove. I don't use an open hearth or a cast iron stove, although I did, through the generosity of the folks at the National Park Service, they measured Mary's stove for me. So I was able to develop a complete understanding of how that stove worked. But, looking at ingredients, you can find substitutions. For example, saleratus is a common leavening, an ingredient that makes things puff up and rise. And that was very common back in the 1820s, and you see it brought forward into the 1840s. And prior to that, it's pearl ash, which this all comes from trees and is highly refined. It's really much easier to just go get a box of baking soda. And it serves the same purpose. And as far as I can tell, and again, this is something where you really need a time machine to go back to measure the height of your biscuit against one made back in 1830, I think it's a reasonable substitution to just kind of go one for one.
The heat has to be different in today's stove versus back then.
Well, that's a really interesting question, and people can accommodate that kind of cooking now today. If you're on a camping trip and you have a Dutch oven, that's the kind of pan that, the pot that Mary would have used, or Lincoln's mother would have used, which is essentially a cast iron vessel where you put your food in it. You put it over the coals in the fireplace or the open hearth or out on a camping ground, and then you put the other coals on top in a rimmed lid. Mm-hmm. So you're essentially doing what we do in a modern oven. You're surrounding what's being baked by heat top and bottom.
Well, if we're not in our backyard, though, and we are in the kitchen, are we going to find the taste a bit different nonetheless? We can't really get back?
I don't know. Without being able to go back and taste it, you can't really tell. Again, my goal was to get as close as you could get, as one could reasonably expect to be accurate.
This is a good time to do this. I have here one of our regulars here at the bookshop at Virtual Book Signing. Wendy Wiggers has come in with the almond cake that Mary herself would make and was known, and the recipe is here in your book. Now, Wendy did not have the recipe did not have your book yet. And she brought in the recipe for us from the National Park Service homepage that has it in the Lincoln home. And we've shown that to you. And we're going to try to taste this now.
Okay.
And let's see what it's like. Why don't you take a taste
Well,
over here?
it looks absolutely delicious, Wendy.
It does. And sorry about all of you out there. But a little later on, we have a whole cake. Save this for you to try.
And it's a very good cake.
This is terrific.
Yep, and it
Now-
has.
Tell me the differences from your recipe and what you think might have been a different taste that Mary might have had.
This is a lovely cake, and it's very well balanced. It has it's sort of like a basic cake. It has, you cream the butter and sugar if any folks at home are bakers, and then you add the flour and the baking powder, and then this cake uses beaten egg whites in addition to the baking powder to make it rise. And this is a recipe, it's I've seen it all over the place. It was kind of one of the beginning parts of my research for the book, was you see this recipe a lot. And
Is it known as Mary
it's
Lincoln?
known as Mary's white almond cake, Mary Todd's white cake. It has several names, and you see it all over. As far as I can tell, and Dr. Temple was kind of instructive in helping me understand where it came from, I think it came from a newspaper clipping in the Helm family papers. And the Helms were cousins of Mary Lincoln, and Katherine Helm wrote a biography of Mary Lincoln. So that's kind of where the recipe started, but it doesn't say exactly where it came from. And the Todd family story is that this was a recipe that the family liked in Lexington, and so Mary brought it with her to Springfield, and she made it. And so in Lexington, it would have been made in the 1825s. The problem with that is that baking powder was not invented until the 1840s, and it's really, you don't see it in recipes of the era until the 1870s. So it, on first blush, looking at it, although it's a very good cake, and certainly Lincoln could have considered a bite of this cake the very best cake he ever ate, which is what he said about this cake, Mary's cake. I don't think it's a totally accurate cake that Mary Todd would have made to induce Abraham Lincoln to marry her. Nor would it have been a cake that Mary Todd Lincoln made to feed to their guests when they came to Springfield to tea or evening entertainments. So in order to get closer to what I thought would be a more accurate representation of that cake, as delicious as this one is, I went back to look at the cookbook that Mary Lincoln had, which is Miss Leslie's cookbook. And Miss Leslie has a white almond cake, which is really like an angel food cake, in a way, but you use the egg yolks. But there's no butter in it. So it's that cake, which is the one I used in the book, is a much lighter cake, but you still have to go through the process of pulverizing the almonds and thrice sifting the flour, but there isn't any baking powder in it.
Oh, that's interesting. That would be the difference. I think we have a better cake today. Yes, thank you, Wendy. Now that we're here with this little plate in front of us, there we have a gingerbread man that you made for us and brought in, and it's a bit different because there's something in here called sorghum.
Right.
Tell us about sorghum versus molasses is what most people would ascribe to a gingerbread man.
Yes, yeah, and its shape and texture are different too. The gingerbread man is the closest we have from an actual Lincoln recipe, because in the first debate with Senator Douglas, he talks about having gingerbread man that his mother made for him, and in describing the gingerbread man, you get a sense of the texture, that it has to be something he could carry, he could put in his pocket, and the neighbor boy could cram into his mouth in 2 bites. Which he did. And it also has to have, Lincoln said, as he repeated the story in the White House, my mother used to get sorghum and ginger. So those are the only 2 flavoring ingredients. And as you said, Dan, most we're used to molasses. Sorghum is a simple sweetener which is not as rich as molasses. It's kind of a cross between molasses and honey, and it's really good, and it comes from a plant that sort of looks like corn when it's growing, but it doesn't have ears.
Would you see this more in rural areas than in the cities?
I would think so, because it's something, if you grew sorghum on your farm, you can process it yourself. And whereas molasses is a byproduct of sugar refining from sugar cane.
Now, but you mentioned that sorghum really came in the 1850s in America, but he's talking about much earlier. How did sorghum come to Lincoln of all people?
That's a really good question, and I don't have the answer. I just know that it was special enough that because he's a child of the farm, and he's a young man of the land, he would know what he was speaking of, and he wouldn't say sorghum lightly. It was a specific decision that he had to say sorghum, I think. So that's kind of where it came to. And that's, this is another recipe that you see a lot.